is a timely kind of thing for a few reasons. One, it was clear out of the focus groups that there is a real interest around all of the university, both faculty and staff, to sort of understand more about our financial structure and why we always seem to be fighting the same battles, and why one year kind of morphs into the next, and certain things seem to be perennial issues. But and it's also, I think, a way of sort of promoting transparency and dialogue and conversation around the institution, all of which I think are absolutely great things. And believe it or not, I really enjoy talking about this kind of stuff. I'm sort of a geek about higher education and finances and stuff, so this, for me, is kind of fun. So feel free to ask questions. We'll try to have a little bit of a discussion as we go along. This particular presentation I actually put together for the Board of Trustees, and I gave it in November, so it's fairly recent, and was based on some work that I'd been doing. And really, there are kind of two presentations here, and you'll sort of see where they switch off. One is about benchmarking, which is the main theme and the message that I really wanted to give to the trustees. And I'm going to apologize to all the finance people in this particular room, first of all, because this is all stuff I did on a Saturday afternoon and did not have the benefit of all their great analytic skills. So if there are mistakes in it, they're my fault, not theirs. The second thing is actually part of a presentation I gave to a group of university and college presidents about a week before the board meeting. I was invited to go give a talk in Los Angeles, and the main theme of that was sort of the changing world around us with all the for-profit institutions and the University of Phoenixes and all those guys, and we were sort of commiserating about what all that's meaning for smaller not-for-profit universities like Alliant and like a bunch of others. So I wound up kind of mashing these two presentations together, and you'll see hopefully they fit together. So without further ado, let me just dive into this, get my bearings here. So, again, this was done for the trustees, so forgive me, I'll explain some of the references. But a year ago, last November, I had done a kind of a report card on where we were vis-a-vis the Renaissance Plan. How many have read the Renaissance Plan from 2004? Okay, so some of you are newer, and I really, not because I wrote it, but I think it has set the agenda for much of what we've been doing the last 5 or 6 years. And so I really would encourage you, if you've not taken a look at it, to go back. It's on the portal. You can find out from Francesca how to access it. But it's out there, and it really was a kind of, I've resisted calling it a strategic plan, but it was a sense of direction for the institution that has shaped a lot of what we've been doing. And then last June, we continued that conversation with the trustees with another presentation I did in which they were asking for a kind of roadmap about where we're going to go from here. That one I'd be happy to give to you as well sometime, but really what it boiled down to is that we've got 4 big challenges. One is continuing to grow and to diversify our programs so that we have more and more things going on in more and more places. Secondly, building brand awareness so more people understand what Alliant is. Diversifying our revenue sources, by which I mean not only tuition, but fundraising and grants and contracts and all the other things that we can do to get money. And then kind of a business term, or business school approach, defining our value proposition. That is, what is it that makes Alliant unique in the world? What is it that would cause people to want to either come here and enroll or give us money or whatever? And these are the kind of 4 big strategic challenges that I identified that we need to face. So with that as background, and I think that we're making progress on all those things. We can come back and talk about them later if you want to. Let me also say, when I mentioned the Renaissance Plan, how many of you have read the WASC self-study from last spring? Smaller group. Patty read it. Patty wrote most of it. So if I really was to tell you the 2 things that I think that you should take a look at if you really want to understand Alliant, it would be the Renaissance Plan and our report to WASC that was dated last January, right? January 2nd. 3rd, yeah. And it's also on the portal. It's a very long report, but it really talks a lot about, what we're trying to accomplish and why we think we're doing well, and is, I think, a very honest, very frank appraisal of the university, but really, really good, and WASC thought it was terrific. So it would be good if you saw it. Well, so, I go back to my philosopher's training all the time when I come up on a word like benchmark, and I'm always curious about where it comes from. And I was reminded that benchmarking is actually a surveyor's term. It's used to mark a fixed point off in the horizon from which you can measure things. So that's where the term comes from. Obviously, it gets used in business a lot now as a standard or a reference by which we can measure ourselves or other people. I got a little dizzy thinking about this and found another definition of benchmark. Although it's a cheap joke, there actually is a truth to this, as I'm going to talk about a little bit. One of the things about benchmarking in higher education is it's very difficult to find fixed points to measure against. And there are a few reasons for that. We're in a very, very fast-changing environment. A lot of people think higher education is sort of a stable offshoot of the rest of the economy that never changes. But I've got to tell you, I think in the last 20 years, we're seeing more change in our industry, if I can call it that, than in any other. I don't really care what you point to. I think it's been as dramatic and disruptive as any other part of the economy. We've seen the rise of distance learning. We're seeing investors literally rushing into the market because they're finding all kinds of opportunities in higher education. We're seeing the Cal system really kind of fall apart around our ears right now. We see even not-for-profit institutions, sleepy little schools that nobody had ever heard of. They're all of a sudden establishing outposts on the other side of the country, and so they're acting very aggressively. And finally, we've got lots of changing demographics. Different people are taking advantage of higher education now than were a generation ago, and that means that institutions are changing the way they serve them. This is Alliance revenue growth over the last, 8 or 9 years. And you can see that, if you were owning this business, you'd be feeling pretty good. I mean, we've had really substantial revenue growth from around $52 million in 2001, 2002, up to $75 million projected for this year. So nothing wrong with that. I mean, we're in many ways in very good shape. Can you all see over here? I'm sorry if I block you. Shout out. That's come from a few things. We have increased enrollments. We've increased enrollments since 2004-05 by roughly 20%. Mostly outside of CSPP, which has been our plan. And we have had regular tuition increases, which accounts for some of that growth. And as you know, we've had programs going into areas that they didn't used to be in. So we've got now forensics here, for example, that didn't exist before this year. We've had MFT expanding onto several campuses. We've had the School of Education expanding into other campuses. And so all of those things have contributed to a pretty healthy growth rate. Now, these lines are not easy to see, but in many ways, this is one of the most important messages of the whole presentation. So one of the things we've done is, and I've talked a lot about this in the stuff I've written, is we have changed the percentage of our budget going into academics and increased that and lowered the amount going into administrative costs. So the top line here, the blue line, is stuff that's going into the combination of instruction, academic support, student support, and research. And it's gone from 60% to almost 70% of the budget. Meanwhile, the stuff going to what basically is administrative overhead has gone from around 30% down to almost 20%. This is thanks to your hard work. And we all ought to be really proud of this. And I know that what this translates into is the sacrifices that all of you have made. The fact that, each of you is wearing more than one hat, and we're all working really hard. And quite honestly, if you factor in things like the fact that we pulled back on staff salaries this year, these are some of the things that have contributed to this bending of the curves. But it's really, really critical And much of what I want to talk about is why this is so important to us. But, at a self-evident level, you can see that obviously the more money we're putting directly into the classrooms and directly into student support, the stronger an institution we can claim to be. And I think we've seen a lot of evidence of that, from reductions in student complaints to improvements in graduation rates and retention rates and lots of indicators that we're doing the right thing. And this is really good. And again, I just want to stress it's thanks to everybody here. These are the numbers behind that chart. It's not worth going into the detail, but you see that, for example, institutional support, the fourth line down, went from 27% down to 20%. And the other lines are really a combination of these three plus research. But anyway, the curve is what's important. Now, one question is, okay, so we've done this. How do we know that we're on the right track? Or how much is enough? Have we bent those curves as much as they need to be bent, or should we continue to work on that? And that's where we get into the benchmarking. Now, I'll go back to the picture of the whiskey bottle. Why is benchmarking so hard? Well, it's partly because in higher education there is such a dramatic difference among kinds of institutions. You have undergraduate and graduate, you have science versus the humanities, you've got online, campus-based, etc. So there's a huge mix of kinds of institutions. The fact of the matter is, although there are some common databases, and we'll tap into them, they're either not all that reliable, quite honestly, or they're not very detailed. So you have to make a lot of guesses about what it is you're actually seeing. The categorizations are not always very consistent. Public databases don't really lend themselves to a lot of these comparisons, and there are different reporting conventions for the public universities versus private universities versus not-for-profits. So all those things contribute to making it very difficult to do good comparisons. But what we do know is that if you step back and said, what is it that sort of characterizes Alliant, and where would you look for comparisons, there are a couple of things that really stand out. One is that we're almost entirely made up of graduate and professional degree programs. And secondly, that we've got mostly face-to-face teaching, relatively little online, but we do it over a lot of territory. So we rent a lot of space around the state of California and indeed around the world to deliver our programs. And those two things have a lot to do with the kind of institution that we are. So I'm going to go through three different kinds of benchmarks very quickly. I'm not going to give you a lot of numbers. I want you to get a kind of overall picture of stuff. First of all, we're going to look at what I think of as different levels between master's level institutions and doctorates. We're going to look at publics, privates, and not-for-profits. And then I'm going to identify a set of institutions that I think are enough like us that they're worth paying attention to. And again, a lot of caveats. These numbers don't all square with each other because I'm pulling from different data sets and different stuff, so don't be too upset if it looks like they're not quite consistent. Look at where we are as an institution against the broad array. There are something like 4,000 universities and colleges in the United States. A relatively small number of them grant doctoral degrees, and so right out of the gate, we're in a fairly unique and elite sector of higher education. We tend to forget about the fact that those institutions that have PhD granting authority are relatively few, about 10% of the total. And according to the Carnegie Foundation, there are different slices of the data, but there's something like 100 universities, give or take a few, that are doctorate level, that are dominated by professional education, and have some research going on, but it's not heavily research in the sense that you think of Caltech or Princeton or someplace. There's a slightly broader set of about 1,200 institutions that offer some level of graduate training, master's degrees. So the 400 is a subset of the 1,200. So those are the two sets. And a couple of years ago, a group called the Delta Cost Project in Washington published some data that across these different kinds, baccalaureate institutions, master's level and doctorate level. So I took a slice of these, and I apologize, these are not easy to see, but the first bar, let me first of all say the categories are instruction, student services, and administrative and overhead support. Okay? The first bar are private research universities, like Stanford and Princeton and Caltech and Dartmouth. The second category would be private master's level universities. And I'm trying to think, as I stand here, of a good example of that, but institutions that offer master's degree but not doctorate level training. Nothing comes to mind. If you think of one, shout it out. And then the two sort of blue and gray bars are Alliant, one from 2006 and one from 2008 data. So what you see is that, first of all, just focusing on our numbers, looking at the instruction, the first cluster, you see that growth in instruction. So a higher percentage of our dollar is going to instruction now than it was in 2004. And if you compare that across the sectors, we look a lot like a master's level university. We're well short of the amount of resources that doctoral level institutions typically provide. Now, this is not a huge surprise because, remember, we're giving professional doctorates, not, advanced degrees in nuclear physics, right? And so the cost structure of providing a doctoral program in psychology or education is a little bit different than it is in providing it in biology or some other programs. So, I look at this and I think, not bad. I wish we were a little bit higher compared to the master's level, but my guess is that this is probably not terrible. The next group, student services, and I won't go into all these in great detail, but you see that we're kind of more like a doctoral level institution there. Not quite like the master's degree, but about 10% of our dollars are going to student services. Again, I'd say not terrible, if only because, we're dealing largely with adult students. They don't need quite as much care and hand-holding, although I know a lot of you do that every day. Katie's laughing at me. But if compared to maybe a more intense residential degree program or something, we're probably right in the ballpark there. And then finally, administrative and overhead, and you see there we're a little higher than either of the peer groups. And we'll come back to this later. I mean, one question is, why is that? Why do we have more administrative and overhead costs than others? One likely answer is because we have so much more real estate than others. We pay a lot in lease costs given the size of the institution we are. But we'll come back and talk about that a little bit more. But anyway, I look at this and I say, okay, if we could keep bending those cost curves even more, right, put more into instruction and less into overhead, that would still be a good thing. We'd come out even better off than we are right now compared to some of these peer groups. So as a first pass, good but not great, I'd say. Let me just pause a minute and see if there are any questions. I can talk without taking a breath if you don't stop me. Patty?
Do you have a sense of where you want us to be in doctoral versus masters, if we're not quite one?
Yeah, well, I don't. And that we should come back and talk about it at the end, because there's some other comparisons that suggest that we're actually maybe not that far off from where we ought to be. But again, I think this is not a disaster by any means, but it shows to me there's some room for improvement still. Anybody else? Okay. So this is what I just said. I guess we fall a little bit short compared to the research universities, about right on student services, more administrative costs than others. Okay, second set of data. Forget about all what I've just said. We're going to shift gears now. And in many ways, this is more fun. About 5 years ago, a friend of mine named Sam Wood, who teaches in the business school at Stanford, did a study which was actually published in the Chronicle of Higher Education, in which he looked at the revenue and cost structures of public universities, private universities, and for-profit universities, like the University of Phoenix or Capella or Walden. And he looked at major categories of revenue first. He said, so let me just go through this and build it up. In the public universities, about 20% of their revenue comes from tuition and fees. This is across the entire nation. It's, averaging across a huge set of institutions. Government appropriations, about 50% for public universities, no surprise there. Government grants and contracts, about 22%. And then private sources like gifts and investment revenue and so forth, about 10%. On the privates, Much more comes from tuition and fees. Again, no surprise there. About half of the revenue comes from tuition and fees. Another 18% from government grants and contracts, and about 32% from private fundraising and gifts and endowment and all that kind of stuff. That actually strikes me as a kind of a high number, but anyway, you see more diversity of revenue coming from in the privates. And this is again how we're in the private side, you don't have that guarantee of a government appropriation check coming every year, so you have to make it up each year from whatever sources are available. For-profits, almost entirely tuition driven. That's the business they're in, is taking advantage of the fact that people have ability and willingness to pay for education, and so they make that possible. And only 7% comes from things like investment returns and so forth. So, what does a line look like if we put us up against this group? Well, same data to the left. I've added our bar. 88% comes from tuition. About 4% from government grants and contracts. That's mostly the PSCs. And about 8% from everything else. Okay? So, quick and obvious lesson, who do we most look like? The for-profit guys. Okay? Now we go to the cost side. Expenditures. Public universities devote on average 38% to instruction, 1% to recruitment and advertising, 18% to research, 43% to student services, or support services rather. Privates, 44% to instruction. No surprise there. Private universities pride themselves on having smaller classes, more intimate settings, all that kind of stuff. So they pay more in instruction. Around 2% in recruitment and advertising, 14% for research, and 40% for support services. The for-profits, 33% for instruction, the lowest amount. And get this, 23% for recruitment and marketing. Now, consider the fact that these are, in some cases, billion-dollar operations. And they're spending 23% on marketing, where the rest of the university world is spending like 1 or 2%. This is why Jen's getting gray hair, right? This has really, really transformed the nature of higher education. 19% on what is that? Support services. And, of course, they pay taxes and profits, so that takes another chunk out of their expense base. Okay, what does the line look like compared to that? Here we are. 41% for instruction. Not bad, right? And 55% for support services. More than other guys have. That's tough. And, if we can squeeze 1 to 2 or 3% out for recruitment and advertising, we're doing well. In fact, we've doubled the amount we're spending on marketing in the last year. We've more than doubled it in the last 4 years. And yet you can see that compared to the for-profits, we're still, and we're about average with traditional universities, but against the for-profits, there's an enormous gap. So this is why every time you turn on the radio or television, you see an ad for the University of Phoenix, but you don't see one for traditional colleges and universities. So what's the takeaway from this? Well, on the revenue side, we look like a for-profit. On the expense side, we don't. Right? And this is indeed, I think, one of the big challenges that we've got, is that we're sort of playing two different games. On the revenue side, we're competing for tuition dollars alongside with the big guys, and yet on the expense side, we're trying to look a lot more like traditional universities. And that's why it's been so important to bend those curves, as I talked about, because the more we can put into research and instruction and student services, the more we can become a viable alternative to other private institutions, but at the same time we're competing with people with very, very, very deep pockets. And I want to come back, and I can't stress this marketing and advertising thing enough. And you've all heard many of you have heard me say before that the way in which the for-profit universities have changed the game with regard to recruitment and student services is stunning. And this has happened in the last decade. So that if somebody goes online and places an inquiry about a program, you're interested in the doctoral program in education from Walden University, and you say, my name is John Smith and here's my phone number, please send me information, I guarantee you will get a phone call back within 5 minutes. Try it. And somebody on the other line will be saying, yep, we're ready to get you started. We have classes starting on Monday. Let's sign you up right here and now. That's the way marketing is done. Now think about the way it was done in the traditional higher education world, where you'd send in an application in December. You might hear back that your application was completed by about April, and then they would say, yeah, and we'll consider whether we want you to come next September. Right? I mean, that's the way, the pattern that had been established in higher education for 100 years. We'll get around to telling you if we're interested in having you come on our time schedule, and that's going to be months, not minutes. So, I know there's been a lot of discussion and controversy about our changing the marketing and the admissions structure this past year, but it's driven entirely by the fact that if we do not act more like these for-profit guys, we're not going to have the chance to talk to students, because by the time we get around to contacting them, they've already paid their money to somebody else. And this is a really, 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 really critical issue that we got to just get accustomed to dealing with. And you might wish it was different, but it's not going to be. Let me stop. I don't mean to be giving sermons here. Any questions? I mean, those of you doing marketing and recruitment, you see this, right? Okay. Oops, I went backwards. Okay. Now, third set of comparisons. Again, they don't quite square with what we did before, but the other thing I did was there's this thing called the Form 990, which every not-for-profit fills out, and they're available online. You can go do this yourself. It's easy enough. I just went down and picked a bunch of schools that I was curious about, pulled their 990s, and just looked at a few very, very simple measures. And again, I would not put a high degree of credibility on the consistency of the way people categorize stuff, but it's close enough for our purposes. And I won't read this whole list to you, but there are schools that either are similar in that they do similar things as we do, or they're roughly the same size as Alliant. Or in the case of somebody like Chapman or Pepperdine, they're probably schools that we wish we looked more like because they're bigger and stronger and better known. So I'll focus on a few of them. So here's some data that was just really easy from looking at the first two sheets of a 990. So one was, where does the revenue come by institution? And Alliant is going to appear in the same spot on each of these. We're right here. We're the fourth one in. And I ranked them by size. So you can see, first of all, that, again, the blue bar is that this is all tuition and fees. The greens are things like gifts and grants and other stuff. So this is consistent in that virtually all of our revenue comes from tuition. And, we're a little different than, say, the Claremont Graduate School, which has an endowment and which has a little bit more investment income than we do. But compared to the smaller schools like JFK and the Chicago School, we're not unlike them. Golden Gate has a little bit, but not much, other than tuition. And even for Chapman and Pepperdine, as big as they are, still, probably 80% or 75% of their revenue is coming from tuition. So it's not that we're completely an outlier by that fact. The fact is that smaller schools historically don't raise a lot of money. We tend to think about the big schools and their huge endowments and the amount of money that they raise every year. When I was at Stanford, they were regularly bringing in $500 million a year in gifts and grants. But, there's only a handful of places for which that's a major factor. The rest of us, we're all out there hustling for tuition dollars. So then I'm going to flip to the expense side. So here are three big categories of expense. The bottom one are program services, that is instruction and research, all the stuff that we're here to do. Then management and general expenses, and fundraising is on the very top. This is fundraising expense, that is how much you're spending on trying to raise money. And so again, you see that we're In this case, we look an awful lot like Golden Gate. We look a lot like Claremont. We look a little bit like the Western University of Health Sciences down in Pomona, in that we're devoting a very high percentage of our expense base to instruction, which is great. We're not spending all that much on management in general as a proportion of expenses. Fundraising is so tiny it doesn't even really show up in our case. But notice that's the case for everybody except Chapman and Pepperdine, where I don't even know if you can see it, but there's a tiny little sliver on the top. So the fact is that most schools of our size don't spend a huge amount on fundraising because, frankly, the payoff isn't there. We could spend a whole lot more on sending more mailings out to our alumni. I'm not sure that the return would be all that much different. It's just the nature of the beast. But I look at this and we go back and say, how are we doing compared to our peers? And I think we're doing okay. Against the really small schools, Kennedy and Chicago, they're devoting a much higher percentage of their expense base to management than we are. Program services, this is just a different way of characterizing the last one. So if you look at the direct expense in instruction and research and stuff, this indicates that we're at about 80%. I think the earlier chart had us at around 70, so there's some slippage in the numbers there. But nonetheless, based on this method of categorization, again, I'd say we're doing okay. We look just like Golden Gate. We look a lot like Claremont. We look a little bit like, what is that? We're better than National. Much better than the small schools that we compete with. So that's a pretty encouraging comparison. Here's management in general as a percentage. And again, we're right in line with a kind of peer group. I think some of this is a function of size. The JFK and Chicago are so much smaller that, to have the basics of the administration in place, it just eats up a much bigger percentage of their budget. But we're not doing too badly there. And here's one that frankly surprised me a little bit. This is basically our facilities costs compared to this set of peers. We're at about 8% roughly of our dollars going to paying rent and lease costs. Again, we don't look any different than Golden Gate. Actually not that much different than National or Pepperdine. This is one where I would have expected we were a little bit higher. So it's mainly a place where we need to do some more investigation. But the fact is that almost every school in that list has now multiple campuses as well. So one of the other phenomena of the last decade is that even small schools have started to branch out and have lots and lots of satellites. So I don't know how many Golden Gate has right now, but I know a couple of years ago they had about 11 or 12 satellite locations around the state. Pepperdine's got them all over Southern California, etc. And we've seen Chicago, moving into our territory in Los Angeles and so forth. Total compensation as a percentage of expense. So what this says is that in Alliance case, about 60% of our expenditure dollars are going to paying people. That's consistent with everything we've said publicly in the budget discussions for years. And again, it's not bad compared to the other institutions that I've put up here. In fact, we're at the high end of that group. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that we've tried very, very hard to increase compensation levels around here over the last 5 years. Senior administrative compensation. 2% for Alliant. Again, we look right in line. I would say this is almost directly associated with the size of the institution. So if you take the senior management, takes a very, very big bite out of a very small school and a much smaller bite out of a big school, but we're in line. But my guess is that that's almost proportional with the size curve. So, what do we take away from this? Well, obvious points. Our revenues are somewhat less diversified than comparable institutions. It'd be great if we had more research contracts and grants and gifts and so forth. So that's something we've tried hard to work on. Our distribution of expenses, give or take a little bit, is roughly in line with what we see at other institutions. And I think that's probably, again, a mark of the progress we've made over the last 5 years. And again, I just backtracked a little bit from this. Our cost of occupancy is a little higher than the rest of the peer group, but not surprisingly so. So I have to stop blaming our landlords for our problems. Okay, now let me just stop a minute and ask if there are any questions about that before I go on, because I'm going to shift gears slightly. Everybody's asleep. Okay, I've succeeded. You're all asleep. Okay. Now I'm actually going to dive into that earlier presentation that I told you about, that I was talking to a bunch of college presidents about, which was really more about, not so much about our numbers, but about kind of strategic issues that we all face. And I'm happy to say that, you stand up and you talk to a bunch of people who are all smarter than you, and you worry a little bit about whether they're going to agree. There were a lot of heads nodding, so I felt pretty good about having put this up. So, what are the strategic implications of a lot of these things? Well, I often tell the story that when I was at Stanford, one of my jobs, it was kind of a nightmare for me personally for a while, was managing a huge campus construction program. And it was a nightmare only because I didn't know what I was doing. And the people who manage these things always used to say that when you're putting up a building, there are three variables. There is the quality of the building, there is the schedule, and there's the budget. And you can have two of those, but you're never going to get all three. So pick what you want to do. If you want to stay on budget and on schedule, you're probably going to have to trim the quality a little bit. If you want to have all the quality you want, then forget about the budget, because you're not going to do it, right? So there's this kind of pick 2 out of 3, and you can decide where you want to be successful. Well, I translated that into our situation in higher education today. I think there's quality, there's convenience, and there's price. Pick 2, because I'm not sure you're going to maximize all 3. So if you look at what I call the big box universities, the Phoenixes and the Argosies and so forth, what they're really maximizing is convenience to the students, right? They're saying, you all come whenever you want to on your schedule. You can do it online in your pajamas at home at 11 o'clock on Sunday night, or you can come to our campus, whatever. And you contrast that with the traditional, not Alliant, but the traditional method in higher education, was to say, we're going to have classes at 10 and 2 on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and that's it. You either come or you don't get credit, right? That gap is something that's gotten narrowed now. So we have to be more sensitive to the needs and demands of our students and try to be more convenient for them. But we still have to try to do it with a sense of quality and integrity that we value a great deal, and we have to do it within a price range that our students can afford. So I think that, if you say, where are we in terms of the competitive environment, I think we've tried very hard to emphasize quality, which I think we should still continue to do. And I think the difference between convenience and price is a little up for grabs right now. I mean, I think we're trying to have it both ways, and we got to think about that. It's a tough issue for us. Second point, and these are really just kind of random observations of mine. We, like all of higher education, has really ramped up the tuition levels over the last 20 years. And there are lots and lots of studies about this. My own gut instinct about this is that we're coming to an end of that period. And so whereas we could always count, and not just Alliant again, but the whole higher education community could pretty much count on always being able to raise tuition a couple of points higher than general inflation. So, if inflation is running at 3, we could be at 5. The cumulative impact over the last 20 years is now that I think higher education is in danger of pricing itself out of reach for so many students. And in our case, this is a very particular issue because our students are calculating what they're going to pay us versus what they're going to make when they get out. I mean, that's one of the things about having this direct link between a program and a career. And as things intervene to affect the salary earnings of psychologists and teachers and managers, we got to be careful that we don't get out of sync. So whereas we have on average over the last 5 years, I think, raised our tuition probably in the 3, 4, 5% range every year. Again, like everybody else, we're not unique in this. I don't know how much longer that's going to be able to be sustained, even in a time when the publics are raising their tuition by 30%. Institutions that have admissions departments instead of rejections departments are going to have to spend more and more on marketing. If you think about it, the most elite institutions basically are in the business of keeping people out. They reject 90% of the people who apply. That's not our situation. We're at the other end where we accept, depending on the school, anywhere from like 70% in CSPP to almost 100% in some of our programs. And that means that we got to keep trying to get people interested in coming here. So that goes back to the thing about marketing and how we have to be much more aggressive, smarter, quicker. We just have to put a whole lot more into that in order to continue to have the opportunity to attract students here. I hear a lot from people who say, why don't we start a big online program? That seems to be where all the money is, where all the growth is, and it's true. There's a huge amount of growth there. I saw something recently that online education now accounts for about 11% of all students in higher education, up from about 2% a decade ago. So it's growing incredibly fast. And within that amount, something like 60% is being done in for-profit settings. So it's really tough, and that makes it difficult for a place like Alliant to break into the business. Even if we were able to put an online MBA program out there, you still go back to how are you going to tell anybody it's there? How are you going to get attention to it? How are you going to compete for space on Google compared to the 500 other online MBA programs that are out there, all of which kind of look exactly alike. So it's difficult. I'm not giving up on this. I think it is an area that we need to continue to explore. But it's not a given that you can just put a bunch of courses up there and all of a sudden people are going to find you and come. Lucrative niche markets are going to be increasingly difficult to defend. This is, I don't know, maybe a little too jargon-laden, but what I really mean by that is that we've had the benefit, and CSPP is really the pioneer in this, of saying here's an area that the big universities really weren't interested in. That's why CSPP got established, is because the public universities in California didn't want to teach clinical psychology, and frankly the privates didn't either. So CSPP, a bunch of people got together and said, okay, we'll do it. And now for 40 years, we've been the dominant player in that niche because nobody else wanted it. Now what I worry about is when other people start wanting it. Then we've got a different kind of a problem. And we've begun to see some of this. We're seeing, again, the CSUs have moved into the EDD business, Doctorate of Education, something that they were not permitted to do by law until about 5 years ago, and now all of a sudden it's an area they're focusing on. And I think that those boundaries between these small professional schools and the big universities and the publics and the for-profits, all those boundaries are getting fuzzier and fuzzier. And one of the big questions is, where is professional education going to wind up in that mix? And I don't know the answer to that, but it's something we all have to be really, really cautious about. Used to be that we could say, well, we don't need to worry about them. They're not accredited. They're not going to get accredited for 5 years because WASC, moves at a snail's pace. And so there was this, what an economist would call a barrier to entry that kept a lot of players out of higher education. My view is that those barriers are pretty much gone now, that anybody who wants badly enough to figure out how to get accredited can do so fairly quickly through a variety of ways, one of which is to, it's really this one, the second bullet point. A lot of investors are now buying up sort of small, failing, not-for-profit institutions, converting them to for-profit, and sort of stripping off the accreditation. And we've seen a lot of examples of this, and I think we're going to see a lot more of it. Size matters. I think that one of the things that we all need to be continually worried about is, when do you get to a point where you're there's sort of economies of scale, and that's a lot of what the cost analysis showed us. I think we're not bad, but we're in a group of relatively small institutions. I mean, the things that were not on my chart were the big guys, the big publics and the big private universities that dwarf us in terms of size. And so we have to figure out how to continue to compete on a relatively small scale. And finally, just kind of a global line. I mean, this was, again, in a context of a group of college presidents. I mean, as a nation, I think one of the things that we really lack is a kind of coherent policy about affordable, high-quality education. It's not that different than the debate that's going on right now in healthcare. Sooner or later, that debate's going to emerge when it comes to higher education, but we haven't had it yet, but it's on its way. So that's the presentation. Now, let me just, a couple of things that are not kind of on the slide set, but let me just conclude with a couple of remarks. I gave this presentation to the trustees in part because, I wanted to sober them a little bit about the challenges that we all face. And this isn't about me, it's about everybody in this room, right? Because you all are on the front lines. You know what the marketing issue is like. You know what the financial issues are like. You know what it's like to have to continue to contain costs and cut budgets and all that kind of stuff. And I think it was important for the trustees to understand both that that's a reality that we face every day, but also that this is really being driven by external circumstances. It would be nice if the world would just stop and we could all kind of relax a little bit, but ain't going to happen. So our job is to continue to be smart and to look out to the world around us and figure out where we can do our jobs, do it really, really well, and continue to attract the support of students and donors and all kinds of other people. I'm 100% sure we can do it. I mean, this is really not meant at the end of the day to be a pessimistic report, but it is meant to be a realistic one. And that I don't think it's likely to get a lot easier in the near future. And I've said this a couple of times in some of the memos that I've written. I think that in today's day and age, being a relatively small, not-for-profit institution is a tough way to make a living. It's incredibly satisfying, for me at least, and gratifying, and I know that we all feel like we're doing good, important work. But wishing for the day in which it's all of a sudden going to be easy and there's going to be lots of money rolling around, I think is a little bit naive. So all that's by way of saying I really appreciate everything that you all do and how hard you do work. And, I think that we should be proud of what we're doing here at Alliant. I think we do more with less than almost any institution I know of, and that's really something to be proud of. And, with continued, commitment and determination, I'm convinced we can continue to not only, hold our own against this competitive environment, but continue to improve and get better and better. So thank you for that. And that's it. Thanks.